I'm Bhagwan Satiani. I'm a vascular surgeon by background. Currently, I'm a professor emeritus and academy professor at The Ohio State University. I was in practice for 25 years in the community and then returned to academic practice for another 15 years. Jessica?
Thank you. My name is Jessica Bailey-Wheaton. I'm a Senior Vice President and General Counsel at Health Capital Consultants, which is a healthcare, financial, and economic consulting firm. By trade, I'm an attorney. So in my work, I provide some of the research necessary to support our firm's certified opinions of value related to the fair market value and commercial reasonableness of healthcare transactions. And thank you so much for letting me join you today.
So today, following the session on buying a practice, we're going to talk a little bit about selling a practice. While the life cycle of surgical practice varies, many surgeons at some point would consider selling or part of their practice. Other than retirement, there are several reasons for selling a practice. They include the owners wishing to grow, realize that the practice is not going to be financially solvent soon, or simply just burnt out. Employment may be attractive to many surgeons because of the advantages with joining larger networks and health systems. Beyond work preferences, physicians may also decide to sell for financial security, particularly with the COVID pandemic, and some for lifestyle considerations. But then private practice has its own advantages, and certain surgeons dissatisfied with being employed are returning to managing their own practice. The seller has several options to consider about where to look for a buyer as far as selling their practice. Most commonly these days, it's a hospital or health system, the same specialty or a small practice, and increasingly large single specialty or sometimes multiple specialty groups that expand or wanting to enter the location geographically. Sometimes it's an existing physician buyer who's a partner or associate in the practice wants to buy it. And in some surgical areas, especially dermatology, ENT, ambulatory surgery stuff, it's a private equity firm. So these are the entities a seller might be looking at. Our focus today here is on a surgeon selling to another practicing entity only. Since if an existing physician shareholder wants to buy the practice, a partnership agreement should be in place to cover this. Selling a practice to a hospital or health system may be somewhat similar in terms of the valuation process, but there are many other considerations that arise, such as restricted covenants. So the situation is not discussed today. Having spent a lot of time and energy building the practice, there's an emotional component to the sale. In addition, the event is a significant milestone in the clinician and the seller's life, both emotionally and financially. Prior to the decision to sell, some questions will have to be answered, such as, is my family supportive of selling? Is this a good time to sell? Will I be happier working for someone else, giving my authority and autonomy? Am I sure what I will do with your time if I'm choosing not to do anything at all and retire? What happens if the operating controlling arrangements do not work out if you're part of the new practice? How will I deal with the downsides on unemployment if you choose that? A recent Medscape 2022 survey listed what employed physicians like least about their jobs. These include less autonomy, 48%, more workplace rules or authority, 34%, less income potential, 33%, and mandatory performance or incentive targets, 24%. Ms. Bailey, I assume that one of the initial tasks for a seller is to compose a team of professionals to work with searching, negotiating, and executing the sale, right?
That's correct. Like selling a house, the process of selling the practice should start well before the practice actually goes on sale, probably 12 months or sooner, and preferably as soon as a firm decision is made to sell the practice. Once that decision is made, the owner will want to get their house in order, so to speak, ensuring that their business documentation, licenses, etc., are up to date, compiling all the documents that will be needed for sale, and resolving any outstanding obligations. If the sellers are seeking a specific value, they may want to proactively obtain a valuation of the practice, which we'll discuss later on, and see what financial or operational issues may be improved upon in order to maximize value. Once that decision to sell is made, a team should be put together as soon as possible to bring in the expertise that is needed to execute the many facets of selling a practice efficiently and at the best price possible. Depending on the circumstances, these team members may include legal counsel, who will draft the contracts and ensure the deal does not violate healthcare laws, compliance, who will help with the due diligence, brokers who can help with finding a buyer, as well as with a lot of the details of the negotiation and transaction, such as helping with price negotiations and documentation of the deal, a valuation professional if a valuation is needed or required, and a financial planner or accountant who can help you structure the transaction to be most advantageous to you in regards to taxes, as well as future compensation in order to align with your financial goals. The next step is to consider what type of transaction this will be. Generally, there's two types of physician practice transactions, asset and equity. Asset transactions typically involve the sale of the entirety of the business, where the seller can identify what specific assets and liabilities they want to transfer to the buyer. On the other hand, equity transactions, which are also known as stock or membership unit sales, typically occur when a physician is selling a piece of the practice. You're selling a certain percent interest or a certain number of shares in the business. Although in certain circumstances, you can certainly sell the entire equity of the business. When you sell the equity, the buyer can just assume the practice's bank accounts, payor agreements, HR policies, etc. But that means that the buyer, on the other hand, also assumes the practice's liabilities, both known and unknown. The practice transaction life cycle from both the seller and the buyer's perspectives is shown here on this slide. And you can see that although there's no fixed timeline noted in this schematic, most purchases will take about 6 months from start to end. Dr. Satiani, how about the sale itself? What options are there to consider when you're contemplating a sale?
Yes, similar to buying a practice, the seller also has to be clear about the goals for selling, as well as post-sale goals, particularly if you're the seller and you will then be an employee of the buyer. Even more importantly, if there's more than one seller, such as if you're in a group practice or they're partners, the goals have to be aligned. This becomes difficult sometimes in a large group, as the reasons for selling may vary from, let's say, a senior person retiring, who may have a very different outlook than a younger person who's just starting out. Other complicating factors may be if all partners are not equal shareholders, such as if one physician has veto power, or if only some physicians are owners of the building or ambulatory surgery center or an office-based lab, while others are not. This creates misalignment and tensions within the group. So these interests, colliding interests, have to be aligned. The seller has several options in terms of the sale, depending on the goals. If the legal structure is an LLC, the buyer receives membership interests. Whereas if it's a PC, a professional corporation, the buyer receives stock. If the seller or one of the owners wishes to merge with an existing practice and close their previous one, the new practice then will continue with the assets and liability of both practices. In the rare situation where the seller wishes to keep certain parts of the existing practice, the buyer just simply acquires the assets and leaves the liabilities with the seller. Ms. Bailey, can you walk us through now the financial part, please?
Absolutely. The price is certainly open to negotiation and may rely upon comps, which is short for comparable sales. Although in most cases, there may not be many similar surgical practices sold in that location or similar practices that are selling similar assets. The price may also be decided based on the fair market value opinion if one is obtained. In addition to the price itself, the payment terms, how that price will be paid, will also need to be negotiated between the parties. A common method of determining the sales price is to use multiples, or X times earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization, known as EBITDA, to arrive at the expected earnings of the practice in the future. That multiple is open to negotiations as the parties will arrive at the number depending on the local market, the rate of growth, referral patterns, the scope of the practice, local economy, population growth, etc. If the seller is retiring or moving outside the geographical area, the purchase price can be paid in cash or over an agreed upon schedule. If not, the buyer may propose some cash, stock in the company, or earnouts, which is compensation in the future if the practice achieves some financial targets, which is commonly a percentage of gross sales or earnings. Dr. Satiani, can you talk a little bit about how these negotiations typically proceed?
The buyer has concerns also. They may have concerns, and the seller has to be prepared ahead of the negotiations to be ready to address this. For example, the buyer may want to purchase the practice, but on condition that you, as a seller, stay for a prescribed period of time, possibly a year or two, to integrate the existing patients into the practice. This is fairly common in a lot of practices. If the seller is willing, the buyer can then employ the seller on a W-2 basis or through a transitional services agreement. As a seller, you may believe it prudent to have the prospective buyer sign a non-disclosure agreement in order to keep the discussions private while the negotiations are going on, so as to prevent them from simultaneously negotiating with others while the sale is being discussed. Once the seller's goals are clear, one of the tasks then is to have it appraised to determine the fair market value. Ms. Bailey, valuation and fair market value is your expertise. So would you explain this, please?
Sure. A practical way to frame FMV, or fair market value, at least per the Internal Revenue Service, is the price at which a practice would change hands between a willing buyer and a willing seller when neither is under any compulsion to buy or sell, and both sides have reasonable knowledge of the facts. Healthcare organizations often obtain fair market value opinions in order to meet one of the exceptions under the anti-kickback statute or the Stark Law. And practice transaction can be utilized for a variety of transactions in transactional purposes. As physician practices may have limited tangible assets, typically they only own the furniture and equipment that comprises the practice. The value of intangible assets, such as goodwill, is particularly important. Goodwill may be defined as an intangible asset arising as the result of the name, reputation, loyalty, location, products, and other similar factors not separately identified in the practice. There are no clear guidelines for estimating goodwill, so the buyer and the seller will have to negotiate the value of that goodwill, each putting forth their estimate of the reputation of the practice. A dialogue must also be held about how to deal with accounts receivable or other capital assets or liabilities, such as bank loans. This can also be factored into the valuation process. If the sale is to another group or is a merger, many issues will have to be resolved, including governance, the scheduling of patients, call coverage, patient volumes, compensation, bonuses and incentives, benefits, expense allocations, etc. Dr. Satiani, as you know, price negotiations are extremely important. So can you talk about how the two sides come together in this? And additionally, can you touch on how the seller and the buyer can fairly divide up the total value of the practice?
Correct. So one of the things I've learned is you pretty much, the seller and the buyer have to work together in a methodical, calm fashion, because both sides want the negotiation to work and achieve the outcome of the sale. So in terms of negotiation, the seller has to decide whether they want to sell the entire practice or a share of the practice, with the buyer being part of the new one, or the seller wants to sell but remain a partner, which will be up to the buyer. So for the entire practice, the common items negotiated, of course, including the price, is how is the purchase price going to be paid back? Is it cash? Is it installments? Or some other way that they've negotiated with? A non-compete is fairly common, but again, this is open to negotiations. I think the other one, as I mentioned, is whether the seller is willing to work for a limited time so as to allow the patients to become familiar. So that, again, is something to be negotiated. If the seller wishes to continue to own a share of the existing practice, then negotiations will be about almost every part of the process, including valuation, due diligence, etc. The next slide shows what is retained by the seller, which is the personal fixed assets and the working capital, minus any inventory in the practice, such as supplies, goods, machines. The buyer is essentially purchasing fixed assets that are not movable and intangible assets, which is something like goodwill that we've discussed before, plus the inventory. Ms. Bailey, we also hear this term due diligence. Can you please explain this? In addition, what documents need to be prepared for the sale?
Due diligence is akin to kicking the tires before buying a car. This means the buyer will review and analyze your practice's relevant source of value and risk profile before doing a deal. Another goal of due diligence can be to identify any risks that are often synonymous with liabilities and/or hidden costs, and any non-compliance with healthcare laws, and finally, to determine if any necessary regulatory filings are needed. On this next slide, we list the documents the buyers will need to access. So the seller will need to be prepared to provide these at the buyer's request. Dr. Satiani, are there any other items for the seller to pay attention to here?
Yes. As an example, an item may be potential tail medical malpractice expenses. This has to be negotiated, and this may involve purchasing a tail policy or paying for converting a claims-made malpractice policy to an occurrence policy. Then what happens if the seller owns the real estate, such as the building where the practice is located? The buyer may elect to include the market value of the real estate in the transaction, or a separate arm's length lease may be worked out. Similarly, negotiations are held for any ancillary services or ambulatory surgery center or an office-based lab if the seller is wishing to sell these and the buyer is agreeing to buy these. After the deal closes, the practice will have to notify patients, the malpractice liability carrier, and the state and federal agencies as to the change in ownership. Whenever a practice undergoes a transaction where the majority of the business changes hands, there will nearly always be some notice, consent, application, or other process to engage in with respect to each permit, such as a license, certificate of need, certification, provider number, or filing with any governmental bodies, state and federal sometimes, necessary for the conduct or relating to the operation of the practice. whether the seller or the purchaser responsible for such notices will have to be negotiated. In terms of concluding, as far as strategy is concerned, it is really important to start to be clear about the selling strategy and the goals, to define the type of buyer that would be best suited for the seller's practice, and the buyer be happy and successful. Essentially, your goals derive the strategy, which then becomes a roadmap for the sale initiative so that both parties are satisfied. You're only as good as your team. And as Jessica pointed out, be sure to recruit your team, whether they're legal counsel, compliance, broker, valuation professional, and our financial planner or accountant at the outset. So nothing is missed. We are both pleased to bring this information to you on behalf of the American College of Surgeons, and thank you for listening.
Thank you.